Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Arfat. Welcome to a brand new video. In today's video, I'd like to share with you what Raymond Brown says from his introduction about the Gospel of John. Is John a genuine gospel, combined sources or development of tradition? I'm reading from page 362 here of Raymond Brown's introduction, published by Yale University. Is John a gospel in the same sense in which Mark, Matthew, and Luke are gospels? According to the majority view, the synoptic gospels had their roots in memories of what Jesus actually did and said, even though the material stemming from those memories has undergone selection, theological reflection, narrative embellishment, and simplification in the course of a preaching that separated the actual occurrences in the late 20s and the final written composition 30 to 70 years later. Is that description true also of John? From the 2nd to the 18th century, that question was answered in the affirmative, with the assumption that John, one of the 12 apostles of Jesus, this John the son of Zebedee, that's what Raymond Brown is saying here, not only supplied the memory of what had happened, but also wrote it down. Thus, John's Gospel was a surer guide than Mark or Luke, neither of which had been written down by an eyewitness. Because Mark and Luke wasn't the immediate disciples, okay, wasn't the 12 disciples. Mark was the companion of Paul and then of Peter, and Luke was of Paul. The differences between John and the synoptics were explained by supposition that in his old age the apostle read the other gospels and decided to supplement them with his own, more meditative memories. More meditative memories. In the last 2 centuries, however, a more critical mindset recognized that there is in John not the slightest sign that its author intended a supplement, nor has he supplied any key as to show his material could be fitted together with the synoptic material, because there's a lot of contradiction to which he makes no reference. Accordingly, the majority of scholars shifted towards the position that John was not authored by an eyewitness. Initially, that perception had the effect of moving the pendulum to the other extreme in relation to historicity. The material in John was now judged to have no historical value, unlike the materials in the synoptic gospels. Within this approach, it was first assumed that for information about Jesus, the author of John was entirely dependent on the synoptics, from which he imaginatively reshuffled material into fictional narratives. A number of studies from different perspectives, however, began to gain dominance for the view that John was written independently of the synoptics, and this is the view that majority of scholars held today. The theory then emerged that the fourth evangelist drew not on the synoptics but on non-historical sources. Bultmann's theory of three sources attracted much attention. Okay, the first one is the sign source, consisting of miracles selected from a larger collection. According to Bultmann, miracles do not happen, and so these were fictional stories designed to make projected image of Jesus more competitive in a world that believed in miracle workers like Hanina Mendoza, Hani the Circle Drawer, okay, Apollonius of Tyana. So although this Apollonius of Tyana is way later, but according to Bultmann, or what Raymond Brown is trying to implement, what Bultmann actually said, or what it could have been, the narrative is that because the earlier author of John, he wanted to depict Jesus as superior than all these other miracle and wonder workers, and so he also attributed to Jesus several miracles like healing the leper, blind, and bringing the dead back to life, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, I believe that Jesus did miracles, but if you were to approach this from strictly historical perspective, then majority of scholars out there do not recognize that miracles happen, because miracles is something supernatural. And in historical criticism, scholars do not accept the supernatural. But then again, Raymond Brown argued in this book, I can't remember where, but he says that obviously Raymond Brown do not reject miracles, and so his opinion is not that of the atheist or even the agnostic, because there's a lot of scholars who completely reject miracles. Um, and I think I've made a video about this in the past, that just because history cannot replicate something that happened in the past, for example, like miracles, it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. But then again, if we were to approach this from an academic perspective, it is evidence-based. If something cannot be repeated, then it is deemed to be false. And this is the approach that Western academics have taken. Now, B, a revelatory discourse source, originally in Aramaic poetic format, containing the speeches of a revealer come down from heaven. These were translated into Greek, adapted to serve as speeches of the Johannine Jesus, and then combined with the sign material. Okay, and C, a passion and resurrection account drawing on synoptic materials. The C part here, I believe, probably John has the same source of that Mark, Matthew, and Luke uses. I don't think John uses Mark, for example. That's beside the point. By the middle of the 20th century, the pendulum began to swing back. Studies in German by Schweitzer and Rushtul found the same stylistic peculiarities in all three sources proposed by Bultmann, an observation leading to the ironic suggestion that the author of the fourth Gospel, Gospel of John, would have had to write all three sources himself. This is very ironic. Dodd, in his book Historical, had a leading role in arguing that at times in the words and deeds of Jesus in John, there is tradition that has every right to be considered as old as traditions in the synoptics. Now, I agree with this completely, because I agree that even in John, we do have primitive narrative contains in John. The theory gained followers that John was a gospel not unlike the others, undergoing three stages of development as they did, a theory that I espouse. This is a theory that Raymond Brown espouses. Okay. Now, Raymond Brown changed his mind in his later, before he passed away in 1998. He wrote in his book, the Community of the Beloved Disciples, because later on in this book, Raymond Brown says that, in his commentary of John, he says that the Gospel of John, the Gospel of John was written in 5 parts, and the earliest part goes back to John the son of Zebedee, but he changed his mind later on, just to make that clear. At its beginning, there were memories of what Jesus did and said, but not the same memories preserved in the synoptics, specifically in Mark. Perhaps the difference stemmed from the fact that, unlike the pre-synoptic tradition, John's memories were not of standardized apostolic origin. Then these memories were influenced by the life experience of the Johannine community that preserved them, and of the Johannine preachers who expounded them. And Bart Ehrman agrees with this as well. So does Dale Martin. Finally, an evangelist who plausibly was one of the preachers with his own dramatic and creative abilities shaped the tradition from the second stage into a written gospel. Okay, meaning, just to summarize what Raymond Brown said here so far, is that there is a sign source. There are 3 main sources, and then someone by the name of John, or whoever it could be, He take materials from all these sources, and then he shaped the gospel. And then later on, someone must have introduced more materials or possibly added to relate it to the Johannine community. Um, because, well, we could only speculate because we don't really have any evidence. But this is an educated guess, and my guesses is that the reason why they change it, the reason why they added materials to the gospel and cater it to the community, without being anachronistic here, we can say that probably because they have the Johannine community disagree with the earlier gospels, because by the time John was written, Mark would have probably been disseminated, and this community, Raymond Brown says in Ephesus, but according to tradition, Mark was probably written in Rome or in Alexandria, these two places. But then again, it could probably have traveled to Ephesus. Alexandria to Ephesus is a very long way, but books do get distributed in the ancient world. And if Mark was written era before 70 and John was written around 100, 30 years is a very long time for books to be disseminated from Alexandria or Rome to Ephesus. And so it is plausible. It is absolutely plausible. But then again, we have no evidence. We could only speculate. Finally, an evangelist. Okay, I've read it. Both the synoptics and John then would constitute independent witnesses to Jesus, witnesses in which early tradition has been preserved and also undergone theological reflection as the message about Jesus was adapted to ongoing generations of believers. So the message keep on changing, it keep on being adapted to different communities, because different communities evolve throughout the time, and so the teachings needs to be catered. Johannine community are more leading towards Gnosticism, and so possibly the community deviated towards that to cater to its theological needs. But again, I don't know, these are just speculations. Although John has sometimes been deemed the most theological of the Gospels, the theological difference becomes one of intensity and of the extent to which theological insight is woven creatively and imaginatively into memories of Jesus. Although the approach just described has a respectable following, in the last decades of the 20th century, one cannot speak of unanimous approach to John. Okay? There are those who think they can detect with great precision the gospel's sources, okay, or at least the sign source, usually 7 signs. Jesus did many more signs. Okay? Only 7 have been mentioned in John. This is according to the Gospel of John. Even if the Bultmannian judgment about non-historicity is no longer necessarily part of the picture. Frequently, the source is presumed to have originated within the same community that gave rise to the Gospel, so that the difference between a source and an earlier edition becomes somewhat nebulous. As for relationship to the synoptics, although the majority probably still holds Johannine independence of the synoptics, an articulate group whose arguments are urged with determination by F. Neyring, I don't know how to pronounce his name, contends that John drew on Mark and even the other synoptics. The other synoptics, I don't think so. Mark, probably. Observations pertinent to these differences will be made in the subsections to follow. Now, comparison of John to the synoptic gospel. Okay, a comparison of the 4th gospel to the first 3 gospels shows obvious differences. Peculiarities of John include a Jesus conscious of having pre-existed with God before he came into the world. This is John 17:5. a public ministry largely set in Jerusalem rather than in Galilee, like we find in Matthew and Mark and Luke. Okay? The significant absence of the kingdom of God motive. Okay? And the only passage described about this is in John 3 and 5. Why is that so? Long discourses and dialogues rather than parables. Again, we have no parables in John. The only parables that occurs in the New Testament is in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. No diabolic possessions, a very restricted numbers of miracles, only 7, including some that are unique, like changing water into wine, which is never found in the synoptics, including healing a man born blind. Jesus healed the blind, but never healed a man that is born blind. Okay? And the raising of Lazarus. Jesus raised the dead, but the dead is not mentioned. It is not Lazarus. According to statistics supplied by Desologues in a French study in 1979, there are parallels to Mark in 15.5% of John's passion narrative. Okay, the suffering. Passion basically means suffering. The parallels to Mark in the Matthew and Lucan passion narratives would be 4 times higher. Okay. Yet there are also important similarities to the synoptics, especially in the beginning narrative of the ministry featuring John the Baptist, and in the concluding narratives of the passion and empty tomb. Why is it that John, so much different than the synoptics, but still contains the passion narratives? Okay, like Jesus the resurrection occurs following Matthew and Luke, because Mark never has any resurrection account. The most accepted Mark, 16:8, not 9 to 20, has been rejected. And so, why out of all these only John includes passion narrative? So this got me thinking that probably John have the passion narrative account in front of him, or he is aware of that. However, he is not aware of the materials contained in Q, which Luke, Matthew have access to. John never have any materials in Q. If you know the Q hypothesis, again, this video is beyond that to describe you. Read a book by Burton Mack, as well as Ziba Crook. Where was I? In particular, the closest similarities are with Mark, example in the sequence of events shared by John 6 and Mark 6:30, 8:11, and in such verbal details as genuine not of great value. This is what Raymond Brown says. Like for example, in John 12:3, the 300 denarii, and in Mark 12:5, the 200 denarii, so on and so forth. There are parallels with Luke, but more of motive than of wording. Okay, this is very significant. Okay, because we know Matthew and Luke plagiarize Mark, sometimes word for word, especially Matthew. But Luke changes a lot of Mark. But John, he has the same concept behind him, but he doesn't plagiarize Mark in a sense. For example, okay, figures like Martha and Mary and Lazarus, which is parabolic in Luke, and Annas' lack of a night trial before Caiaphas, the 3 not guilty statements in the Pilate trial, post-resurrectional appearances of John in Jerusalem. Okay, only John follows Luke, whereby Jesus appears to the disciples in Jerusalem. Matthew, Jesus appears to the disciples in Galilee, and Mark has no appearance of Jesus after his passion. The miraculous draught of fishes in John 21, whereby the people catch a lot of fish. There are fewer similarities with Matthew, yet compare John 13:16 with Matthew 10:24, and John 15 with Matthew 10. Yeah. A variety of solutions have been suggested. At one end of the spectrum, some would posit John's knowledge of Mark or even of all three synoptics. I disagree with this. Okay? Such proposal may disagree as to whether John also had an independent tradition. At the other end of the spectrum, the fourth evangelist is thought not to have known any synoptic gospel. Again, I disagree with this. I think John probably knew Mark or a source that Mark used, or probably a parchment of Mark here and there that only contains the passion, and that is why he does not know the earlier contents of Mark before chapter 8. Or even, where was I? Yeah, at the end of the spectrum, the fourth evangelist is thought not to have known any synoptic gospel, and occasional similarities between John and the others are explained in terms of the synoptic and Johannine traditions independently reproducing with variations. Okay, with variations is what Raymond Brown says. The same deeds or sayings. In between the extremes, a median position that he himself espoused, maintains that Mark and John shared common pre-gospel tradition, and this is where I agree with Raymond Brown. Oral or written, I believe it is probably written, a bit of a written source, and that although the fourth evangelist had not seen the final form of Luke, he was familiar with traditions incorporated later into Luke, like the L material. Some who make a distinction in John between an evangelist and a final redactor would posit that the only latter knew one or more of the synoptic gospels. The primitive John, the author of the primitive Johannine gospels, probably do not know the other synoptics besides Mark, or the source that Mark uses, and even a little bit of Q. But then, since the Gospel of John was written in several parts, and I believe this is also true, probably later on, they would probably, the second author or the redactor, basically redactor means editor, since they knew a little bit of the synoptics, they incorporated materials in the edited materials and incorporate the synoptic tradition as well. So anyway, we know here that historians reject the historicity of the Johannine Gospel today. Raymond Brown wrote this 20 years ago. But I wouldn't say this book is outdated. Okay, I wouldn't say this book is outdated. But some of the consensus in academia have shifted. Obviously, Raymond Brown had passed away, so he will not have the opportunity to edit his manuscripts, and I don't think any scholars would want to edit Raymond Brown's manuscripts besides the abridged version, which was published 10 years ago in 2013 if I'm not mistaken. But scholars today have shifted away from what Raymond Brown wrote about more than 20 years ago, and that scholars today reject completely the historicity of the Johannine narrative. Now, I still share Raymond Brown's opinion. I don't think that this is to reject completely all the traditions in John. I think that is a bit radical. Even though John differs so much from the synoptics, but to reject the entire gospel as being non-historical is, I think that is a bit too radical. Why do I think that? Because if you look at it, John does contain primitive sayings that are non-Gnostics. Okay? Because if we look at John, there are certain passages in John that pretty much has a low form of Christology, and other passages have a high form of Christology, and the synoptics has a low form of Christology. So if we extract the low form of Christology in the Johannine narratives, we can somehow say that this is more primitive. And this probably goes back to the original author of the Gospel of John. Like for example, John chapter 4, whereby John met the Samaritan woman at the well and say that I am he, I am the Messiah. Ego eimi. I am the Messiah, I am he. I think this is the this is parallel with the story of the Samaritan woman in the synoptics, even though it is not the exact same story, but the concept is there. And we know that if we analyze that the synoptic as well as the gospel authors, they like to change their wordings, and we know that they change it probably because to cater to their own community, but the underlying story is still the same. And so if we can find these traditions that is parallel in all four gospels, especially John to the synoptics, then we can somehow assuredly say that this is probably primitive, and that there is probably the main source. And then when Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John took this main source, they changed it to fit their own community. But then again, we do not have early manuscript evidence to suggest this. And Q is hypothetical, but no doubt I think Q used to exist. So does M and L, but I believe M and L is more oral tradition. Because if they have a written source, then it is less likely for them to change rather than oral tradition, whereby each stories change in oral tradition, okay, much more than stories change when authors are copying them. Bultmann did a great study in the orthodox corruption of scripture, but his study focuses on the 2nd and 3rd century, because we do not have any manuscripts from the 1st century, obviously. But his studies is based on tangible evidence, meaning on manuscripts tradition. But what about a study on the changes that occurs orally in the 1st century? Now this study cannot be conducted because we do not have any evidence, and so a study of this sort will need to be based on hypotheses. And I've done a little bit of this as well by myself, and I came to the conclusion that probably we do have a main source, probably an oral source that whoever disseminated orally, and people tell stories. They go to a different place, they go to Ephesus, they tell stories, and then stories got changed. The reason why they change, again, no one knows why they change it, but it does get changed. And so from the main story that we have, probably I don't believe there's only one main source. Probably we have a few main sources that narrates the same identical story, and probably it got changed. And so do we have the original story in the synoptics as well as in John? That is very, very hard to say because we have no evidence, because they contradict one another. And when there's a contradiction, there are a couple of things we can assert: that all the stories are false, or that there is one story that is correct and everything else is false. Now we are in the realm of hypothesis here because we do not have any evidence. All we can do is educated guesses. Scholars that are more radical would say that all the stories, whenever there's a contradiction that happens between them, all of them are false. And that I found to be very radical. There's no evidence to suggest so. And there's also no evidence to say that probably Mark was correct and that all the other stories are false. But that is the approach that most academic scholars have taken. And that Mark sets the standard because Mark is the earliest, but doesn't mean the earliest meaning that it is the most accurate. but that is how the study is being done today. And so whenever we have Luke and Matthew changes the account of Mark, then it deems to not be historical, even though Luke and Matthew probably got it from M and L and Q. But Q we can tell so much because we do have Luke and Matthew that attest to Q. So this means that we have multiple attestation. Okay? And whenever we have multiple independently attested account, it is deemed more historical. M and L is a bit problematic because we do not have multiple attestation. We only have one, that is we found in Matthew and Luke. And so this is a bit problematic. So a lot of scholars disregard M and L to be historical because there's really no evidence to suggest that they are historical. If we take this skeptic approach, but then again, there is also no evidence to suggest that they are not historical, unless we based it on Mark. But how do we know that Mark is historical? How do we know that? Doesn't mean that it is the earliest gospel, meaning that it is historical. It could be that Luke, when he wrote an orderly account, knew the narrative that Mark was using. And we know this for a fact because Luke eliminates certain aspect of Mark and changes certain aspect of Mark. Could Luke have probably known a source that Mark changed? Can we trust Luke's orderly account? Personally, I don't, because the evidence goes against that. But again, if you take a more conservative approach, you will probably agree with Luke. But personally, I don't. So anyway, hope discussion is fruitful to you. And so the Johannine sayings that have high Christology, it can be read in two ways. And it has been interpreted by Trinitarians to mean that Jesus is ha theos. Again, critical scholars will not agree with this. Jesus is not Yahweh. Trinitarians will go to passages in Genesis, in Exodus, to say that Jesus pre-existed before the Son pre-existed, and then he came down to earth. This is all problematic. First of all, there is no evidence to suggest so. The passages that they choose can be interpreted in multiple ways. They don't really have strong evidence. How can you, again, I'm using the words of the church fathers here. Okay. How can your origination comes after your pre-existence? It doesn't make sense. How can you only originate after you exist? No, when you exist, that is when you are originated. So how can you say that the Son exists and then he came down to earth, and yet the Son is God, the Father is God, the Holy Spirit is God? There are three persons sharing the same essence. This is very problematic. It is opening a can of gods, which we don't need to. Using the words of Shabir Ali here, Dr. Shabir Ali. But anyway, I'll see you on my next video. My name is Arfat. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.